He was one of America's greatest presidents. But did you know Franklin D. Roosevelt married his cousin, feared the number 13, and even hid a swimming pool under the White House? It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. FDR's legacy looms large for leading the nation through the Great Depression and World War II. Yet behind the scenes, he had some truly bizarre quirks and secrets. Today, we're uncovering 10 weird facts about Franklin D. Roosevelt that will leave you surprised and seeing a whole new side of this historic figure. Get ready for family secrets, strange superstitions, hidden hideouts, and even presidential pranks. 10. He feared the number 13. It turns out one of America's boldest leaders was superstitious about the number 13. FDR's personal secretary, Grace Tully, recalled that her boss was superstitious, particularly about the number 13. Roosevelt hated sitting at a table with 13 guests or embarking on trips on the 13th of the month. In fact, if a dinner party RSVP left 13 people on the guest list, FDR would often invite an extra last-minute guest, frequently his secretary herself, just to avoid the ill-fated number. He also went out of his way to avoid traveling on the 13th. Tully noted that many times FDR scheduled his train departures for 11:50 p.m. on the 12th or just after midnight on the 14th, solely to dodge starting a journey on the 13th. This quirk even followed him to the grave. Roosevelt died in April 1945 on Thursday the 12th, barely missing Friday the 13th, as Tully wryly observed. It's oddly comforting to learn that a man who famously told Americans, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," still held a tiny personal fear of his own, the number 13. This superstition didn't hinder his presidency, but it certainly added a peculiar ritual to his social life and travels. 9. He married his cousin. Franklin's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, wasn't just the First Lady. She was also his distant cousin. Franklin and Eleanor were fifth cousins, once removed, both belonging to the extended Roosevelt family, which had split into two branches generations before. In an era when marrying a distant cousin wasn't entirely unheard of in high society, Franklin fell in love with Eleanor, whose maiden name was also Roosevelt. They married on March 17, 1905, and the wedding had a presidential touch. President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle, attended and walked the bride down the aisle. The charismatic Teddy Roosevelt, who was Franklin's fifth cousin as well, happily gave away his niece at the New York City ceremony. At the time, Franklin was a young law student, and the two newlyweds even postponed their honeymoon so he could finish his semester. The family connection didn't stop FDR and Eleanor from becoming an influential power couple. Eleanor would go on to redefine the role of First Lady, and FDR would often joke about being related to everyone in America by either blood or marriage. This unusual Roosevelt family tie is a reminder of how interconnected some historic figures were. It's definitely a weird fact that one of our most important presidents found his life partner at a family reunion, so to speak. 8. His lifelong hobby was collecting stamps. When he wasn't busy leading the free world, FDR loved nothing more than to unwind with a book of postage stamps. Yes, stamp collecting was a passion he'd had since childhood, and it became his favorite hobby throughout his life. In the stressful days of the presidency, Roosevelt would spend a bit of time each evening with his stamp album, finding it the perfect way to relax. He even said, "I owe my life to my hobbies, especially stamp collecting." That might sound like hyperbole, but considering the weight of the crises he managed, the Depression and World War II, those quiet moments sorting stamps were like therapy for him. Roosevelt's hobby wasn't just casual, he was deeply involved in philately. During the 1930s, he personally helped the Postmaster General brainstorm new stamp designs and themes. In fact, FDR sketched ideas for over 200 stamp issues released during his administration. He took pride in things like choosing stamp colors and subjects, seeing it as a way to educate and inspire the public. His son James later remembered how his father would sit at his desk, utterly absorbed, with an expression of complete relaxation and enjoyment on his face, while working on his collection. Through something as simple as collecting stamps, Roosevelt found a daily escape and a source of joy. It's a charming insight into his personality. Even as he juggled global responsibilities, he remained a bit of a nerdy collector at heart, treasuring the tiny artworks and history lessons found in the postage stamps. 7. He was the first U.S. president on television. We all know FDR for mastering the radio, with his famous fireside chats. But he also holds a lesser-known record. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first U.S. president ever to appear on television. The groundbreaking moment came on April 30th, 1939, at the opening ceremony of the New York World's Fair. Television was a brand new technology then, and only a handful of TV sets existed, mostly in the New York area. FDR's speech at the World's Fair was broadcast on those early TVs, making history in the process. Imagine a tiny audience gathered around grainy black and white screens, watching the President of the United States live. It must have felt like science fiction at the time. The TV appearance was brief and reached only a small local audience, but it symbolized the dawn of a new media age. Roosevelt, who was already a pro on radio, joked that it was a good thing most voters couldn't see him on TV, because on the new visual medium, they might notice he was in a wheelchair. More on that in a moment. In truth, the novelty of television didn't yet threaten radio's dominance. World War II soon halted most TV development, and it would be another decade before televisions became common in households. Still, FDR's televised World's Fair speech was a quirky first. It's a fun fact that the first president on TV came years before the medium really took off. Roosevelt always had a flair for communication, and being a TV pioneer, however limited the broadcast, adds another cool footnote to his legacy. 6. He survived an assassination attempt before taking office. Less than a month before FDR's first inauguration, he had a near-death experience that few people remember today. On February 15, 1933, Roosevelt, then president-elect, was in Miami, Florida, giving an impromptu speech from the back of an open car. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. A man named Giuseppe Zangara, an unemployed bricklayer, fired a pistol at Roosevelt's vehicle, emptying the gun in a frenzy. FDR was unharmed, miraculously, but 5 other people were shot in the crowd around him. The most prominent victim was Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who had been sitting near Roosevelt. Cermak was hit and later died of his wound. Chaos erupted as onlookers tackled the gunman. Incredibly, Roosevelt kept his cool throughout the incident. As the angry crowd was ready to mob Zangara, FDR urged them to let the authorities handle it, saying something like, "Leave justice to the authorities." He then had the presence of mind to direct the car driver to rush the gravely injured Mayor Cermak to the hospital. Reports of Roosevelt's calm and decisive reaction made headlines, and they helped cement his image as a strong leader under pressure. Remember, this was just as he was about to take office during the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. So, Americans took reassurance in his steady demeanor. Zangara, the would-be assassin, claimed he hated all officials and rich people, not Roosevelt personally. He was swiftly tried and, after Cermak died, executed for murder in March 1933. This bizarre episode could have altered history had Zangara's aim been better. Thankfully, FDR lived and went on to lead the nation through incredibly challenging times. The Miami attempt is a forgotten dramatic footnote in Roosevelt's story, showing that even before he assumed office, he literally dodged a bullet. 5. He temporarily changed the date of Thanksgiving. Here's a strange presidential decision. FDR once moved Thanksgiving up by a week and caused an uproar. Traditionally, since the time of Abraham Lincoln, Americans celebrated Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. But in 1939, that last Thursday fell on November 30th, leaving only 24 days until Christmas. Retailers worried that the shortened holiday shopping season would hurt sales. Remember, this was during the Great Depression, when businesses were desperate for revenue. So, Roosevelt, prodded by store owners, proclaimed Thanksgiving a week earlier, on Thursday, November 23rd, 1939. He thought an extra week of shopping would give the economy a little boost. Instead, chaos ensued. The change was highly controversial. Many Americans were confused or angry that the president would tinker with a beloved holiday. Thousands of letters of complaint poured into the White House. Some states decided to rebel. Their governors simply ignored FDR's new date and kept Thanksgiving on the 30th. That year, different states celebrated on 2 different days depending on the governor's orders. Families in different states couldn't celebrate together because they had different days off. Football schedules were scrambled. calendar makers had a nightmare because all their 1939 calendars were now wrong. And even the following year, 1940, remained confusing because Roosevelt repeated the experiment once more. The press jokingly dubbed the mess Franksgiving, combining Franklin and Thanksgiving to mock the decision. 4. He hid his paralysis from the public. One of the most remarkable things about FDR is that he led the nation while unable to walk. Yet most Americans of the time had no idea about the extent of his disability. In 1921, at age 39, years before he became president, Roosevelt was struck by poliomyelitis, which left him paralyzed from the waist down. He could not stand or walk without heavy steel braces on his legs and someone supporting him. However, FDR was determined to continue his political career and to appear strong and capable in the public eye. In an era without social media and with a more cooperative press, he managed to hide his paralysis from public view as much as possible. Roosevelt almost never allowed himself to be photographed in a wheelchair, and news photographers and film crews generally avoided showing him struggling to walk. In fact, out of the thousands of photos taken during his 12 years as president, only a handful show his wheelchair at all. FDR went to great lengths to fake mobility. With iron leg braces locked in place, he practiced gripping a companion's arm and inching forward to simulate a walk. He even designed his own lightweight wheelchair out of a kitchen chair, so it would be less bulky and easier to maneuver through doorways. When giving speeches, he often stood by, holding onto a podium or the arm of his son for support. There's a famous account of him delivering a campaign speech in 1932. He moved away from the microphone, lost his balance, and fell to the floor. Gasps went through the crowd. His aides quickly lifted him, and FDR, showing incredible poise, grinned and continued speaking as if nothing had happened. The audience erupted in applause, admiring his courage without fully realizing the cause of his fall. 3. He built a secret White House swimming pool for therapy. Being paralyzed from polio, FDR found that swimming was one of the best exercises to maintain his health. He loved to swim and used it as physical therapy to strengthen his upper body and relieve stress on his legs. So, shortly after he became president, a unique addition was made to the White House, an indoor swimming pool just for FDR. In 1933, a campaign led by the New York Daily News raised money from the public, over $12,000, to construct a pool on the White House grounds for the president's use. They built it inside the West Terrace between the White House and the West Wing, and it was completed in only a few months. Roosevelt took his first dip in the new White House pool on June 2, 1933, gleefully calling it his tank. The pool was a 50-foot-long tiled haven where FDR could swim privately every day. Aware that he needed the exercise for his muscles and circulation, Roosevelt swam almost daily, sometimes inviting close friends or even reporters to join him for a casual chat in the water. Photographers were not allowed, maintaining the secrecy of these sessions. The public knew generally that FDR enjoyed swimming, but few realized the pool was specially built because of his disability. It remained one of his favorite retreats, a place he could float freely, unencumbered by braces or wheelchairs. 2. He loved driving in a specially modified car. Despite his paralysis, FDR was determined to enjoy as much independence as possible, and that included driving a car. Roosevelt actually loved driving, especially on his estate in Hyde Park or at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. Of course, with non-functioning legs, he couldn't use standard pedals, so he had custom hand controls installed in his cars. His favorite was a 1936 Ford Phaeton convertible that he had modified so he could operate the throttle and brakes with his hands. This setup involved devices and levers, designed by a local mechanic, that allowed him to control the car entirely without his feet. Whenever FDR got behind the wheel of that Ford, it gave him a sense of freedom. Imagine, in an age before power steering or modern accessibility tech, Roosevelt zipping around his country home, steering with one hand and working hand controls with the other. Neighbors in Hyde Park would see him driving that car on nice days, wearing a cap and grinning ear to ear. At Warm Springs, he'd sometimes take fellow polio patients for rides, showing them that life could go on despite their disabilities. He once joked that driving was a form of escape. Nobody could wheel him around if he was literally at the wheel. 1. His dog Fala became a political legend. Franklin Roosevelt's little black Scottish terrier, Fala, wasn't just a pet. He became a national celebrity and even played a role in FDR's political success. Fala was a constant companion to the president. He traveled with FDR, slept at the foot of his bed, and entertained guests with tricks. By 1944, in Roosevelt's fourth-term campaign, Fala was so famous that Republicans tried to cook up a bizarre scandal involving the dog. Opponents falsely accused FDR of accidentally leaving Fala behind on a trip to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska and supposedly sending a Navy destroyer to retrieve him at great expense too. This ridiculous rumor was untrue, but Roosevelt's critics pushed it in an attempt to portray him as wasteful or out of touch. Roosevelt, who by then was tired and ill health and facing a tough re-election against Thomas Dewey, found the perfect way to turn this rumor to his advantage. In a September 23, 1944 campaign speech to a Union audience, FDR addressed the so-called Fala issue with brilliant humor. With a playful grin, he said, "These Republican leaders now include my little dog, Fala. I don't resent attacks, and my family doesn't resent attacks, but Fala does resent them." His Scotch soul was furious. He joked that Fala, being Scottish, was offended at the idea he'd cost the taxpayers millions, and he has not been the same dog since. The crowd roared with laughter. Thanks for watching, and be sure not to miss what we've got coming up next. Check out our next video for another surprising history story.